and I'll just get into it, right? And so today's topic is identification of native oak species in Illinois. And it's amazing the diversity we have of oaks in the state. They range everywhere from, small, little, almost shrubs at times, like blackjack oak here, to our towering, huge timber trees and things like that. And so there's a lot of variation. Oaks are diverse in our state, both in their size, their shape, as well as the habitats they grow in. And before we get into ID, just a little bit to celebrate some of the bigger oaks we have in the state. And I'm sure many of you have seen the state champion cherry bark oak down at Heron Pond. If you haven't, it's here in Johnson County and truly a spectacle to see. It's really a wonderful tree. Over 96 inches in diameter, really just an amazing. And we've got others. The state champion Shumard oak is over 100 inches in diameter. Just a beast of a tree out there. And so we have some really big oaks in the state. And a little more recently, I was lucky enough to nominate and measure this new state champion pin oak. And this one's down on Cypress Creek National Wildlife Refuge, just a big, beautiful old tree. So there's a lot of neat individual oak trees to celebrate and to see in the state, as well as just understanding the oak species in general. And oaks are an important part of our forest here in Illinois. In fact, oak hickory forest types comprise 68% of the total forest area in Illinois currently. So the majority of our forests kind of are classified as oak hickory. And of course, then oaks are historically been, an important component of our forest for, about the last 10 to 12,000 years. And they still are the dominant canopy species in much of our forest in Illinois. So oaks are a critical part of our ecosystems, a dominant species out there on the landscape. So knowing more about your oaks can certainly be worthwhile. And if you look at the data, and this comes from the Forest Service, their forest inventory and analysis data for Illinois, and this is volume of live trees. So you can see the top 10 trees in Illinois. Three of the top four are oaks, just to show you how abundant oaks are. We have a lot of big old oaks kind of on the landscape. And those three, the white oak, black oak, and northern red oak, are certainly our most abundant common oaks found across the whole state. But we have plenty of others as well. And in fact, in Illinois, we have 20 different species of oaks that are native to Illinois. And so we have 12 that fall into the red oak group, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So those are black oak, blackjack, cherry bark, northern pin oak, it's sometimes called Hills oak, northern red, nuttall, pin, scarlet, shingle, shumard, southern red, and willow. So 12 red oaks and 8 white oaks. So our white oaks are bur oak, chestnut, chinkapin, overcup post, swamp chestnut, swamp white oak, and then of course our state tree, the white oak. So a lot of different species out there, 20 different ones, and we're going to try to cover every one of them today. And in terms of where oaks are in the state, really Southern Illinois is the concentration of oak diversity in the state. And you can see here two counties in particular, Union and Alexander County down in the far southwestern corner. Each have 18 oak species that's native to them. So just an amazing number. But generally the southern third of the state has a lot of our oak diversity. As you go north, you lose a lot of our oaks, but there's still good numbers, 6, 7, 8 species up there as well. And really the reason why Southern Illinois is so diverse on oaks is that we are at the northern edge of a lot of southern oak species. We're also at the western edge of a lot of eastern oak species. And in fact, out of our 20 oak species, really 9 of them could be classified as extreme edge of range species. These are ones that just kind of sneak into Illinois, and mostly in the southern bits of the state. here. And so a lot of these would be more abundant farther south, and then two of them, particularly scarlet oak and chestnut oak, are more abundant to the east, right? And so Illinois gets a lot of its diversity by being at the edge of these species ranges. And because of that, and particularly because we're at the edge of species range, we have some rare oaks. So a lot of these aren't very common on the landscape in Illinois. And in fact, we have 3 species that are so rare, they're considered state listed species. And so we have 2 state threatened species of oak, chestnut oak and willow oak, and 1 state endangered oak, the Nuttall oak. And so I mentioned earlier the red oaks and the white oaks, and these are subgroups. And so oak trees in Illinois, anyway, can be divided into these 2 groups. The red oaks, the section lobate, used to be called Erythrobalanus, and the white oaks, which is the subsection or subgenus Quercus. And so there's some differences in the red oaks and white oaks, and we'll spend a few slides here kind of separating those out. And so red oaks, they don't have tyloses in their wood. And if you're unfamiliar with tyloses, they are basically little almost valves or balloon-like structures that occur in the structure, the cells in the wood, and they kind of act like, well, like valves or stoppers. And so they are allowed to, it's helpful for water loss, and they're helpful for disease compartmentalization and things like that. And so white oaks, their wood has these little tyloses, these little balloons or valves in it, and red oaks typically don't. But ecologically, another important distinction is that red oak's acorns take 2 years to mature. So if a red oak acorn, a red oak flower is pollinated in the spring, it'll take 2 years for that acorn to develop, and then it'll fall at the end of year 2 onto the ground, and it won't germinate until the following spring. So it takes a full 24 months from the point of pollination of that flower to that acorn is germinating. Now, white oaks are much quicker at it. So they, the flower in the spring, their acorn will develop and mature that entire single season. And a lot of times they will fall that fall and then germinate right away. So while it takes 24 months or so for red oaks to go from flower to a germinated acorn, white oaks do that same thing in about 6 months, right? So very, very different that way. And then just in appearance, when you looking at an oak and trying to identify it, you can usually classify them into red or white fairly easily based on a few characteristics. So red oaks, their bark tends to be darker gray or even almost black in color, and it tends to be tighter bark. Sometimes they're smooth or really strongly ridged and furrowed, but the bark seems to be a bit tighter. White oaks in general, with a few exceptions, tend to have lighter gray bark or even almost silvery or whitish bark. And it tends to be more flaky or platy or a little more loose bark. It can still be that ridge and furrow as well. And I really like this picture. I took this a few years ago, and it's a black oak, which is in the red oak group, and then a white oak tree that have fused together as they grow. And so, of course, the white oak's on the left, the black oaks on the right in this picture, and just a neat way to kind of contrast and show the differences in bark between the 2 groups. And so here on the left, you see the majority of those bigger trees there are all white oaks. You can see the lighter color, almost the kind of silvery or white color, the real light gray, the thick bark. And on the right, we have a white oak in the foreground, and in the back is a black oak, one of the red oaks in the background, just to show you the difference. And then here are 2 different kind of common types of red oak bark. Okay, so we have the thicker, dark, almost black coloration on the right, so that's a black oak. And on the left, we see these strong ridges that you see, the lines going up and down. And this is a northern red oak. And this is something that we see, and I'll mention it a bunch when we talk about red oaks here in a minute. is that a lot of red oaks have what we call ski trails, and those are just those long ridges that are kind of shiny and flattened on the top. And so that's a characteristic we look at when we're identifying red oaks, as well as separating the different red oak species. So it would be the presence of those kind of shiny, long ski trails on their bark. And so that's another characteristic that's fairly common in the red oak group. Now, when you're looking at leaves, so red oak leaves tend to be sharply pointed, have sharply pointed lobes, and that are bristle tipped. So they'll have a little tiny bristle sticking out at the end of the lobes. It is also important to note that we have 2 unlobed red oak species in Illinois, but they still will have that little bristle out at the end of the leaf. And then white oaks typically are broadly rounded lobes that lack those bristles. And so if they're pointy and sharp, you would move them over to the red oak group. And if they're rounded and blunt, you would typically move them over into the white oak group. So that's just some real basic ways to separate those 2 groups. But oaks in general, another good characteristic, especially in the winter, are that all oaks in general, the buds, so the buds on the twigs tend to have a clustered group of them towards the end of the twig, right towards the tip. And so a lot of times, even in the winter, if you see a small sapling, if you have it or anything, and you notice that there's a bunch of these buds, a lot of lateral buds clustered around that end terminal bud at the end of a twig, that's a good indication that you're looking at an oak. And so let's just go ahead and jump right into all the different oaks, since we have 20 of them to cover. And the way that I thought we would do this would be to break them into groups by habitat and growth type. So we have whites and reds. Let's start with the whites first, and we'll cover all the whites. So in general, across the state, we have 5 white oaks that I consider upland white oak species. And so these would be found in the drier uplands, not in the bottomlands necessarily, but some of them may. So if you're in the uplands, these are the kind of the 5 that you're going to look for. So those are white oak, post oak, chinkapin, chestnut, and bur oak. And so I've highlighted bur oak there because I'm actually going to address it in another category. So for these upland white oaks, we're going to cover these first 4. So let's jump right in. There's so much information on these that I really can't cover it all in super detail. I put a lot of information into this PowerPoint just so that you'll have that as a reference, and you should have the link to the PDF that was in their little reminder email. If not, we can put it in the chat box. But that way you can kind of use all this information as a reference, but I've underlined really the kind of most important characteristics used to identify each particular tree. So let's start with white oaks. White oaks, of course, are found all across the state. They're typically are large, tall trees. In a forest setting, they're tall, clear trunks and narrow crowns. But if they're in an open grown area, they could be shorter and have real spreading canopy. But in general, white oaks tend to prefer rich, well-drained upland soils. That's where they grow best, and that's where you'll often find them, even though they have a very wide habitat tolerance. In terms of identification, white oaks have leaves with 7 to 9 rounded lobes and fairly uniform in terms of symmetrical on one side or the other. It's fairly symmetrical leaf and fairly uniform in terms of the deepness of those sinuses in between the lobes and things like that. But general kind of regular rounded lobes, most typically you'll find on white oaks. The acorns are often kind of this chocolate brown color when they're ripe and pretty shiny, and they're very oblong, right? So they're elongated, typically a long acorn, and they have a fairly shallow cap. And that just means the little cap, the covering on the acorn, doesn't cover much of the acorn itself. It's kind of perched right on top of the acorn. The buds on the twigs for white oak are small, rounded, and reddish and fairly blunt compared to a lot of the other oaks. And the twigs are moderately slender, reddish, and smooth. But overall, with white oaks, you're looking at those regular lobed leaves and those kind of long, shiny acorns. Now, the bark on white oak can be very variable. They tends to be light gray to silver in color, But in terms of texture, it could be all over the place. It could be everywhere from really tight ridge and furrows, bark, all the way to these real loose, platy, almost shaggy bark like you see in the middle picture there. So it's all over the place in terms of texture, but in general, it really shares that coloration, which is a really light gray, almost silver coloration to it, which is common kind of across all these different textures. So that's white oak. The next, which some people mistake with white oak at times, would be post oak, another very common tree, at least in the southern half of the state in our uplands. This one typically is a lot smaller than white oak, so I classify it as a medium-sized tree. And overall, post oaks generally have a fairly short trunk before it gets to its branches. So they're not very tall, they don't have a long, clear trunk. Usually it has a lot of lateral branches, and it's overall a short tree with a big rounded canopy. Post oaks like dry, poor upland soils, whether that's in a forest or a glade or a barren habitat, but they can also be found in flatwoods communities with perched water tables and heavy clay. So you'll see them in both of those types of community types. The leaves of post oak are typically 5-lobed, and with the 3 outer lobes being the largest, and they're really square often. So if you can see in that picture there how those lobes are really squared off and not just broadly rounded, and they kind of form a cross shape, the leaf does. And that really stands out to me to make it easy to identify post oaks. It would be those 3 major squared lobes at the end that kind of form a cross. The acorns of post oak are the smallest of all of the white oaks we have in Illinois. They're very small. They're also fairly fuzzy or almost hairy, which is different than most of our other white oaks as well. And the cap covers about a half of the nut, right? And that's very different than the white oak, which the cap just barely perches on there. So very small, rounded acorns, somewhat fuzzy. The buds are large for this one and rounded, and the twigs are fairly stout for an oak and fuzzy as well. Post oak bark looks a lot like white oak bark. It tends to be a little less thick, and instead of being platy, it's often broken into kind of regular rectangular little sections. I always think it looks like that old real tree camouflage they used to buy in the 80s. But these kind of regular square rectangular looking sections of bark, still that kind of light gray coloration. Post oak often shows a lot of patchiness. You'll have these patchy smooth sections of its bark. A lot of oaks show that, but it's really common on post oak as well. So the third of our upland oaks is chinkapin oak. And chinkapin is definitely one of my favorite oak species. And it gets mistaken, particularly in the winter, for white oak a lot because they often grow together. Their bark looks very, very similar. Their form looks very similar. And so they can be mistaken in the winter. In the summer, the leaves are very different and the acorns are very different. So we'll get into that. But it is a large tree, fast growing. The big key in terms of habitat with chinkapin oak is that chinkapin oaks strongly prefer calcareous upland soils. And so you're going to find chinkapin oak growing over limestone or other kind of soils that have a real high pH. That's really where they strongly prefer, and you'll really find them in those habitats over any other kind of habitat. And that's a good characteristic when identifying them. If you're not in an area that has a lot of limestone, you're probably not going to see a lot of chinkapin oak. In terms of ID, the leaves really stand out for chinkapin oak. They are very different than a lot of the other oak species, with a couple of exceptions. They tend to be oblong, kind of narrow leaves that are really unlobed. But instead of lobes, they have these regular coarse teeth along the edge that look somewhat pointed. They're almost sharp pointed, but if you get in there and look at them, they don't really have those bristle points, but almost like a coarse sawtooth edge along the margins of the leaves instead of lobes. Really looks different than white oak, so very easy to tell apart. And then the acorns themselves look very, very different as well. So chinkapin acorns are really small as well. They're almost as small as post oak, but instead of being rounded, they're kind of elongated. And then when they ripen to a very, very dark brown, almost black coloration as well. And then it's reported that chinkapin oaks have the tastiest of all the oak acorns. And that's evident if you are a deer hunter, because in October, the deer go for the chinkapin oak acorns first, almost immediately. That seems to be their preferred acorn, and then they move on to the other ones after the chinkapins are all eaten. So it's apparently the best tasting of all the oak acorns. Chinkapin oak buds are kind of rounded, maybe a little bit angular. They're brown in coloration, and the margins of the scales are hairy, so it gives the buds kind of a striped look to them. And that looks very different than the other oaks we've looked at so far. Chinkapin bark does look a lot like white oak bark. And again, if you don't have leaves or acorns, it can be hard sometimes to tell them apart. Still that same light gray to silver color. In general, it tends to drift more to a thinner bark that is scaly instead of kind of a heavy, thick bark like you'll see often with white oak. And that those scales or those flakes tend to break off and flake easy. So it's almost more papery bark at times as compared to white oak, although there's a lot of variation. The big thing with chinkapin and white, if you don't have leaves, would be those calcareous soils and then looking for those acorns. So the last of this group would be chestnut oak. And so chestnut oak is one of our rare oaks. As I mentioned earlier, it's state threatened. So you're not going to see it a lot in Illinois, honestly. But interestingly enough, if you go just south of Illinois into western Kentucky, it is one of the most common oaks in dry uplands you have there. In Illinois, it's really restricted to just a handful of dry upland sites that are rocky or droughty, and just really not that common on the landscape. It's a medium-sized tree with kind of a broad, irregular crown, kind of a big open crown at times. But again, growing in those dry upland sites typically. Chestnut oak looks a lot like a chinkapin oak in its leaves in terms of it's unlobed and toothed. Overall, the chestnut oak tends to be wider beyond the middle, so it kind of gets wider as the leaf goes on, which is a little different than chinkapin. And the teeth tend to be more bluntly rounded and less sharp in chestnut oak compared to chinkapin oak. The big difference, one of the big differences are the acorns. And so the acorns of chestnut oak are huge. They're second only to bur oak in size of acorns in the state. Very large, heavy acorns that are very long, but they have this tiny little cap, that little thin cap that just sits right on the top of the acorn. It's almost comical that way. And it really separates very easy. The acorn, the nut, is not really attached to the cap that easily. So if you're in a forest with a lot of chestnut oak and you get a little bit of a wind in the fall, you're going to get bombed with all these big, heavy acorns falling down. They also tend to sprout really easily, and a lot of times those acorns will even start sprouting while they're still on the tree in the fall. Chestnut oak twigs are fairly stout and hairless, and the buds are angular and pointed as well, but really the kind of rounded teeth on the leaves and those really huge, long acorns will get you to chestnut oak. Perhaps the easiest identification characteristic of chestnut oak is the bark. So the bark doesn't look like any of the other white oak barks. It's much darker, it's dark gray and extremely hard. They call it rock chestnut oak as well, just because the bark is so hard on this species, and it's very, very thick. The ridges in terms of the bark tend to be shaped almost like a pyramid shape. So they're very wide at the base and get narrow kind of at the outer part of the ridges, giving the bark, almost looks like a cottonwood, if you will, or something, a real pyramidal shape to its bark, and it's super hard. You can't bend it or break or pop the bark off or anything like that because it's so rock hard. So very, very different, a lot of differences in the bark from this one, from all the previous upland white oaks that we mentioned. And then I put this together. I'm not going to really talk about this slide, but I just thought I would put the high points of all those different upland white oaks just so you can have them in one slide to compare. might be useful as a reference. But I did want to mention these two oaks next. And so these are two oaks that kind of hard to put into a category because bur oak is an upland oak, but it also grows in the bottomlands and it looks very similar to swamp white oak. So I thought I would treat these as kind of their own category, and I named them stout twigged, thick bark white oaks just because I didn't know what else to name them. But bur oak and swamp white oak, both very common oaks found across the entire state. Bur oak is a very large tree, but it typically is a short trunk tree. So even though it's large, oftentimes it has wide spreading branches that arise lower along the trunk of this tree. And that often gives it this large rounded canopy. And again, bur oak in a wide range of habitats. A lot of you may know bur oak as an upland tree that grows in the savannas or woodlands. But in a lot of the state, and including down in southern Illinois, it's really a riparian streamside tree and grows right along the riparian areas. And so it has this kind of bimodal distribution on the landscape where it's in the really dry sites as well as some of the really wet sites. The leaves of bur oak are really unique looking. So they're large leaves, big leaves with kind of irregular lobes. And we talked about white oak having kind of regular, consistent lobes. Bur oak has kind of irregular lobes. They're huge, they're small, they're a little different. The end of the leaf tends to be fused into one great big lobe or 2 or 3 lobes. And that's followed by a couple of really deep sinuses that kind of cut way into the leaf below those large lobes at the end. And that's really seems to be one of the main characteristics. Even though the leaves are very variable, they tend to have those deep sinuses below that kind of fused top of the leaf. And it really makes it look unusual and stand out. And if you notice, especially on the picture, it's kind of a pale green or a yellowish green underneath on the underside of the leaf. That's going to be important to separate it from swamp white oak we'll look at next. But really, the acorn is very different than any other oak. So it's the biggest of the acorns. All right, it can be very large. I wouldn't say baseball sized, but certainly golf ball size is within the realm of possibility. With a really big, heavy cap, and the cap covers the majority of the acorn, but especially at the edge of the cap, you tend to have these fringed bristles or these burrs that occur all along the edge of the cap, giving it a hairy or fuzzy look, and that really stands out compared to any other acorn we have. The only possible one that looks somewhat like it would be the exotic sawtooth acorn, which kind of has something similar, but a much smaller acorn. So a big acorn with those kind of hairy fringes really makes it stand out as a bur oak. The twigs, particularly on bur oak, can be really thick and may actually develop kind of corky ridges on them, which even makes them look even thicker. And so that stands out in the winter. If you have an oak with really, really thick, kind of corky twigs, you're probably looking at a bur oak. Bur oak bark tends to be dark gray to brown, very, very thick, has very thick vertical ridges and deep furrows. And then again, those smaller branches and twigs with corky ridges. Now that's a little different than swamp white oak. Swamp white oak is also found across the state. It can be in bottomlands and really enjoys bottomlands, but it can also grow in some moist uplands. Has a thick, short trunk, often with broad, round and canopy, very similar to bur oak as well, in terms of its kind of overall look. Although it does tend to prefer the bottomlands more so and less of the dry uplands. The big way to tell them apart, so the leaves on swamp white oak are variable in shape, kind of like bur oak. But if you flip them upside down, the underside of the leaves on swamp white oak will be very white in color, bright white underside, and that's very different than the bur oaks. The other thing would be the acorns, which are borne on these long stalks, these peduncles, right? And so they're often 2 or 3 inches long. And that's really the only native oak we have that has this really consistently long stalk for its acorns. And that jumps out as well. And then the twigs, they're not corky, they're thick, but they actually tend to have flaky or peeling bark on the twigs, which looks very different than bur oak. And that kind of flaky characteristic is even noticeable on younger trees before it really develops its thick bark. Or side branches, you'll notice this papery, flaky bark on swamp white oak, which is another way to easily tell it apart from bur oak, which is more thick and corky. But the two really easy, you're looking at the corky bark on the twigs and the big, heavy acorns with the bristles or the burrs on bur oak, and then the stalked acorns and the flaky, papery bark on the twigs for swamp white oak. That's kind of how to tell those two apart. Now, moving to the last two of our white oaks, those two can be classified as bottomland white oaks, ones that grow in the wet areas. Now, I also listed bur oak and swamp white oak here because they grow in those bottomlands as well, but we're going to cover the two now that we haven't previously covered. One is overcup oak, and overcup oak is also one of my favorite oaks. It's found in the southern half of the state largely. And it's one that really is the wettest site of all of our oaks. This one often grows with its feet in the water, in swamps, really, really wet sites. It can tolerate flooding better than any of our other oaks, red or white. So it likes these poorly drained bottomlands, swamp habitats, frequently flooded riparian areas are where you'll find it. And it often has kind of a weird twisted growth form, really not a strong straight tree or anything like that. So it's an unusual tree. It can have kind of a fluted base at times as well, probably because it grows in those wet environments. Overcup oak, the leaves are very variable in shape. The kind of one characteristic that you see fairly consistently with overcup oak is that somewhere in the middle of the leaf, it'll tend to have very narrow sinuses. So sinuses that come in between the lobes, all the way really close to the central part of the leaf, and almost kind of squarish in shape. And it gives the whole leaf kind of a pinched look, like it was pinched right in the middle of it. And that to me really stands out. And that's really the characteristic that I see a lot in overcup oak, is this pinched look to its leaves. The acorns, of course, look different than any other oak at all. They have a small, kind of flattened, or somewhat rounded acorn, but the cap is so big that it covers almost the entire acorn. It covers sometimes 95% of the acorn. It's over the cap, or the cup covers almost the entire acorn right there, and really looks different that way. In terms of the bark, it looks a lot like a white oak bark, but just growing in the swamps. It may have narrow, broken ridges. It may be flaky or a little platy, but it looks a lot like a white oak bark, just growing in off-site, if you will. Now, swamp chestnut oak is the the last of our white oaks, our 8 white oaks that we're covering, and it's a medium to large tree. They can get really, really big. And they often, in form, are very different than overcup oak. They often grow tall, straight, with a big, clear trunk. It's a great timber tree. And it grows in bottomlands and riparian areas as well, and can tolerate some moderate flooding, though it's definitely not as wet preference as overcup oak. The leaves of swamp chestnut oak look a lot like a chinkapin oak. They tend to be a little larger. They tend to have more teeth or more veins along the edge, but they still have that unlobed with these kind of moderately sharp, coarse, rounded teeth. But the acorns look very different. It's a large, heavy acorn with kind of a big cap. And then the scales on the cap tend to be kind of really strong, triangular in shape, and then really heavy, right? So a big, heavy acorn, big, heavy cap. Really stands it apart from chinkapin oak. Also, the buds tend to be really large in size, as well as kind of reddish in color, and they typically don't have those hairy margins, so the buds aren't as striped as chinkapin. And overall, it's a fairly stout tree, even the twigs. Bark is light gray in color, moderately tight with narrow ridges. Nothing really about the bark stands out much from a lot of the other white oaks, but it's really those big acorns, and then the leaves will make this stand out from a lot of the other ones. So that's it. That's our 8 white oaks that we have native to Illinois. So here's a little quiz if you're interested. If you want to put stuff in chat, here are the acorns from the 8 different white oaks that are native to Illinois. So if you want to put in your guesses, you don't have to guess them all, but any of them, go ahead and stick it in chat, and which ones that you may know or not. I'll just give you a couple minutes here to look at this and see which ones, and then here in a couple minutes we'll identify which ones are which. So just look at them. You can put it in chat if you want, or you can just look and guess yourself. Some of them should be obvious, others might be a little harder. I see different people guessing here in chat. People are doing a great job. Give you guys about another 20 seconds or so to type stuff in. While we're typing stuff in, I really took a lot of effort last year to find and photograph all the different acorns from as many of the oak species in Illinois that I could in one year, and I ended up finding 18 different species. So there's two red oaks species that I still need to find and photograph their acorns, but all the rest I managed to get, and it really was made for a fun adventure in the fall looking for all these. All righty, let's go ahead and ID them. So, as most of you said and correctly identified, number 1 is a bur oak. See how big it is with those fringe. Number 2 is a swamp chestnut. So it has that real heavy acorn with those really triangular scales. Number 3 is a chestnut. So that's a big, heavy, long acorn with that little bitty cap perched on top. Number 4 is a chinkapin, that really dark chocolate, almost black coloration, and a small acorn. Number 5 is swamp white. It has those long stalks on the acorn. Number 6 is a white oak, a long, shiny oak with a small cap. Number 7 is overcup oak with that cap that covers everything. And the little tiny one on the last is a small post oak. So good job, everybody. All right, so those are our white oak acorns. We've got a short amount of time to cover all of our red oaks, so let's go ahead and move in. And so I'm broken them into similar categories. So these are our common upland red oaks. These are found across the whole state. Northern red oak is probably one of our most common trees. It's a medium to large tree, and it has noticeable ski trails along the whole bark. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but that really makes it stand out as an upland tree, a red oak that has those shiny ski trails along the kind of the whole of the tree generally. And this is probably, in terms of the upland oaks, the one that grows in the best growing site. So it likes rich woods, coves, north slopes, productive upland sites. It doesn't really grow that well or that often in the drier parts of the uplands. The leaves have 7 to 9 sharply pointed lobes with bristle tips. You flip it over on the underside of the leaf, it typically is either hairless or has only sparse hairs along the veins. It has a pretty large acorn for a red oak with kind of a thick, flat, shallow cap on the top. The buds are red and smooth and hairless, and the twigs are moderate in size. But overall, with red oak, I really like looking at the bark, those ski trails, that shiny bark, and fairly thin bark otherwise, with flat, thin ridges. And then if you're unsure, you can dig up under the bark to look at the inner bark, and the inner bark is a light pink or light red in color of northern red oak. And that's important when you're trying to tell it apart from the other really common upland oak is black oak. So black oak is also a medium to large tree. It can be a little more crooked and limby if it grows on poor sites, and it does tend to prefer drier sites than northern red oak. So you'll see, even though they grow right next to each other, oftentimes you'll often see it moving into the more drier upland sites or south and west facing aspects. It can also grow in sand savannas as well. So black oak has a very similar leaf to red oak, but if you flip it over, the underside will often have a lot of orange fuzz on the underside of the leaf, and that's a great way to separate it from northern red oak. Also, the acorns are small and rounded, and the cap on those tend to have loose, shaggy scales, and you can see how the scales on these pictures are kind of flaking a little bit or a little bit shaggy, and that really is an easy way to tell it apart from northern red oak. The bark on black oak tends to be darker in color, almost black, and tends to be a little thicker and heavier, and has less of those ski trails. You may find some of those ski trails on the upper parts of the tree, but in the lower parts, it tends to be a thicker, heavier, darker bark overall. And if you peel into the bark and look at the underside of the bark, it's going to be kind of a bright orangish color on the inner bark compared to the pink color of northern red. And so these two common species, you can tell them really the bark characteristics and the inner bark color are really how you can easily tell those two apart if you can't get your hand on a leaf. The third of the common upland red oaks would be shingle oak. So shingle oak really is a much smaller tree. It's a medium-sized tree, and it's really poor formed. It's often limby, branching a lot, often has drooping limbs or dead limbs hanging onto it. It really looks different that way. It'll often hold on to its leaves throughout the winter, at least some of them, and that really stands out. And shingle oak, along with pin oak, tends to be the two species that really get those horned or gouty oak galls on the smaller stems more often than anything else. And this one is pretty shade intolerant, so you'll often find it along forest edges or disturbed sites more than anywhere else. So shingle oak's a little different because it's one of our two completely unlobed or untoothed leaves for our oaks. And so a lot of people mistake this and don't even think it's an oak because of those leaves, which are just entire smooth-edged leaves. They will have a little bristle at the tip. The acorns are very small and rounded with a very thin cap, which you're going to find out as a lot of our red oaks kind of are very similar in acorns as well. But the leaves, and especially that it holds its leaves into winter and often has those galls on it, are really good characteristics to pick out shingle oak. It also has kind of a dark bark that's a little bit variable. It can be tight and thin, or sometimes it can be very thick as well. Overall, it tends to have a bunch of dead branches it'll hold on to, almost like a pin oak. The branches can sometimes droop as well, so it really looks a little different that way. Now moving into the less common upland red oaks. And so these are still upland oaks, but they're just, you don't find them on the landscape as much as the previous ones. So southern red oak you're going to find in the southern third of the state, particularly in the southeastern portions of the state. It's a medium to large size tree, often short trunk and a wide canopy, and it grows in a lot of habitats, but it especially seems to grow well in these kind of low productivity, drier sites. It looks a lot like a black oak at times. The leaves are very different though. The leaves kind of come in two forms, but they both share this really strong vase curved base to the leaf that really jumps out at you. One form, which is where it gets its name, falcata, it tends to have this very long, elongated, thin central lobe that goes out the end of the leaf that often is curved or hooked or falcate, which is where it gets its name. The other form is kind of tri-lobed, where you just have three major lobes, almost like a turkey foot. You see both of these forms even on the same tree at a time, but the general characteristic would be that rounded base of the vase-shaped base of the leaf really stands out. Acorns are small and rounded on this one as well. They don't really stand out. And the bark looks a lot like a black oak. Dark black in color, very thick. And a lot of times if you don't have the leaves and they're growing right next to each other, it's difficult to tell those two apart. black oak and red oak without the leaves or without the acorns as well. You know, it's often broken into these irregular shaped blocks. Again, very similar to black oak. Now, the next one is my favorite tree in Illinois, is definitely my favorite oak, which is blackjack oak. And blackjack oak, you could almost call a shrub at times, right? So sometimes it's very small tree in terms of 10 or 12 feet tall. Other times it may be 20 or 30 feet tall, but it is a small tree with a really poor form, really limby, sometimes multi-stemmed, short, stout, twisted branches. And that's really because it grows in these really extremely poor soils, sometimes right out of the rocks or really, really rocky soils or in barren sites, very, very droughty sites. It can really handle drought and really poor conditions better than any other oak you see. It's also very shade intolerant, so it likes these open areas. In terms of its leaves, it also has kind of two kinds of leaves. It'll have one that is 3 very shallow lobes out at the end, and then another one that is almost like a spatula and no lobes whatsoever. And you see that in that lower left picture. So those are kind of the 2 leaf types that you'll see on blackjack oak. The acorns are really small. They have a real thick cap, and they're a little more long than some of the other small acorns we talked about with red oaks. Buds are sharply pointed and have kind of reddish hairs on it, and it's a fairly stout, hairy twig as well. But the leaves really stand out, thick, leathery leaves, which helps it kind of retain its water. But the bark is really like no other oak there. Very, very thick, blocky, heavy, dark bark on these small trees really stand out. Some people mistake it for persimmon bark at times. Really looks different than most of the other oaks. The next would be scarlet oak. And so scarlet oak is kind of found, it's not that common, but it's scattered across the state. And it's also one of our very, very dry side oaks. And so you'll see it in uplands sites, sandy sites, or places where it's really kind of droughty and dry. And it likes to hold on to its lower dead limbs, right? And so it doesn't shed those limbs very easily, and you'll see a lot of that, which really makes you pick this tree out very easily. A dry site red oak with a lot of dead limbs hanging on it. In terms of its leaves, doesn't stand out real strong necessarily. 5 to 7 pointed lobes with pretty deep sinuses. It looks like a lot of the other red oaks. The acorns look very different though. So the acorns are kind of large for a red oak, and they're flattened. And so the acorn itself, it's like a disc almost. They're wider than they are long. So it's a short, fat acorn. The cap covers a lot of the acorn. But if you look at the end of the acorn, the nut itself, there's often these rings. And you see that in that top picture, these concentric rings that are really noticeable on the nut on scarlet oak, which really stands out. The buds tend to be pretty big, pointed and hairy as well. The bark is pretty similar to black oak or northern red oak, except for, again, they tends to retains these lower dead limbs, which really stands out as compared to a lot of the other upland red oaks as well. So that's a good characteristic along with those acorns with the concentric rings. And the last I'll just briefly mention would be northern pin oak. So northern pin oak, I don't have a lot of pictures of. It kind of looks like a bottomland pin oak. It looks a lot like a scarlet oak, except for the acorns are small and rounded compared to those bigger flattened acorns on scarlet oak. So that's just a little different that way. And it's only found in the northern third of the state. So I don't have a lot of pictures of it, but just to mention it, it looks like a pin oak on a dry site. You'll get you there to northern pin oak. And so the last group I'll mention briefly would be the bottomland red oaks. And so there's 5 of those, right? So the most common is pin oak. Pin oak's a medium to large tree. It's found across the whole state. And it's, especially when it's younger, has a strong pyramidal shape to its growth. And so it kind of looks very narrow at the top and widening as it gets to the base. So the whole tree kind of has a pyramid shape. The lower branches as the tree grows tends to droop and hang down to the ground. As those lower branches shade prune, it tends to hold on to those dead branches like scarlet oak as well. This one's found in poorly drained wet soils, although it's planted all over the place. You'll find it planted everywhere, but naturally it's a bottomland kind of wet site tree. The leaves typically have 5 to 7 lobes that come off at kind of right angles with these really deep sinuses. So these really narrow, skinny lobes kind of coming off at right angles really get you to pin oak. The acorns are very small, rounded. They're often striped. And then the little cap is thin and often comes off easily. It pops off. So a lot of the acorns will fall off and the cap will be stuck onto the, still stuck onto the tree. The twigs are slender and brown, and oftentimes the leaves fall off, but the little petioles will remain, the little stem of the leaf will remain on the, hanging onto the tree even throughout winter, which to me is an unusual characteristic, but seems to be fairly consistent with pin oaks. The bark is probably the thinnest and smoothest of all the oaks out there, very thin, very tight, light bark. Maybe lightly furrowed, but overall smooth. But again, it's those retention of those lower dead limbs and those drooping limbs that jump out to you. Cherry bark oak is our next bottomland oak. This is a very large tree, can be straight trunk, broad canopy, a very valuable timber tree. And it grows really best in these well-drained bottomlands or even sometimes in the moist uplands. Its leaves have kind of a funny little, the lobes are kind of funny. They're tapering. They come off at right angles, but they kind of taper and they get narrower as they go out to the end of the leaf instead of splitting into other little mini lobes. And so that really gives it this kind of funny looking look to their leaves. And that's why they call it the pagoda look. So that's where it gets its scientific name from. The acorns are also small and rounded as well, but those leaves really jump out that they don't look like any other oak leaf with that kind of narrowing, pointing lobes. The bark, no surprise, looks like a cherry, right? It looks a lot like a black cherry. It has those little horizontal lines in it. As it gets older, it'll get kind of black and thickened as well and more kind of oak-like, but a particularly young cherry bark oak looks strongly like black cherry bark. Shoemart oak can look a lot like a cherry bark oak. It looks like a northern red oak as well. It's a fast-growing tree, big tree as well, and it often will have kind of a flared or buttressed base, and it grows in bottomlands, but it likes it more rich or well-drained. It doesn't like a lot of flooding. Shoemart oak leaves tend to have kind of broad pointed lobes and kind of really rounded sinuses. So these big rounded sinuses, the lobes tend to get wider as they go towards the end. Sometimes they're so wide that they even overlap each other. The lobes get so big at the end, they overlap and kind of create a little circle of opening where the sinuses are. The acorns look a lot like red oak. They're roughly the same size as red oak as well. But again, this occurs more in the bottomlands, more so than red oak. So they do look a lot like northern red oak. And even the bark, right? The bark has these noticeable ski trails. As it gets older, it tends to have more deeply furrowed bark. Finishing up, we have a couple more species. So willow oak is a fairly rare oak. It's only found in a couple counties naturally in Illinois, though it is widely planted across the state. This is another bottomland species. It's a medium-sized tree, and to me, what jumps out are the limbs, the side limbs on the tree tend to be very narrow. They don't get very big. Even a large willow oak will tend to have kind of narrow side branches or thin side branches. The leaves, this is the other unlobed. So like shingle oak, this is unlobed, narrow, entire leaf. It really resembles a willow, right? This tiny, thin, narrow lance-like leaf. The acorns are tiny and small, much like a pin oak, and often striped as well on it. But the leaves, it often holds its leaves into winter a little bit, and they're really like no other oak. The bark looks a lot like a pin oak. It's kind of a tight bark, thin bark as well. With these little narrow, skinny ridges on it. And then the last of the all oaks, this is number 20, would be Nuttall oak. And I will admit that I don't have really any pictures of Nuttall oak, so I've got these here. I'm not as familiar with it. So the big thing about Nuttall oak is that the acorns are very elongated. Most of the other red oaks have either heavy, bigger acorns or rounded acorns. These have elongated acorns, and the bases of Nuttall oak, at least when it's growing in its natural habitat, tends to be fluted or buttressed quite a bit as well. And this grows in those poorly drained bottomlands. So you can kind of separate the red oaks by habitat, where we've got some of the driest of the dry red oaks, so blackjack and scarlet and northern pin oak, all the way down to the wettest of the wet red oaks, which would be pin, willow, and Nuttall oak. And so that's one way to kind of separate them. Acorns with a few species is good, but a lot of the acorns look very similar. So you're looking at often habitat and leaf characteristics really to separate them with some of the close look-alike ones. So just wrapping up, this is a very, very quick overview, right? We had to cover 20 species in an hour, so I didn't have a lot of time to cover each species. So we wanted to race through to cover all 20 species. We're going to do a virtual workshop, maybe a 3-hour workshop where we can really cover each species in detail, get into the ecology and biology of oaks a little more, and look for that coming in the fall. But anytime you're looking to identify oaks, use multiple characteristics when you can when identifying oaks. So a lot of variation within the species. There's a lot of hybridization within this group. So sometimes ID can be difficult. Looking and trying to use multiple characteristics such as habitat, acorns, leaves, and all of these can help you kind of get a better ID for these oaks.